Hello everyone, welcome to the Diplomacy course. We will continue with Chapter 2, the historical evolution of diplomacy. First practices. In this chapter, we will firstly talk about ancient diplomacy, then we will continue with medieval diplomacy. Let's start with ancient diplomacy. It is widely accepted that the beginnings of diplomacy occurred when a human being decided for the first time that hearing a message is better than eating the messenger. At this point, with a decision to assure the safety of a messenger, the primitive rules of diplomacy began to emerge. When literate civilizations emerged, primitive face-to-face systems transformed into more sophisticated exchange systems between organized urban communities. The first system of city-states occurred in Mesopotamia between the 4th and the 1st millennium. Sumerians were the earliest practitioners of diplomacy. The diplomatic tradition emerged from this site mainly because the Sumerians were the civilization which invented writing sometime in the 4th millennium BC. Diplomacy was used by Sumerians with a motivation to end conflicts through the conventional method of sending messengers with the message written on clay tablets. The first known diplomatic letter was a message sent by the king of Ebla in northern Syria to the kingdom of Hamazi, north of Iran today, which shows a similar style of language and content of modern diplomacy. Ancient China is another civilization where we could look for the origins of diplomacy as a system. The first records of Chinese diplomacy date from the 1st millennium BC. Diplomacy was based on bilateral relations and missions related to fleeting alliances, including maneuvers, secrecy, and bribery. It is not surprising that Sun Tzu, one of the best-known military strategists, and his thoughts were influential at this period. Early records indicate that Sun Tzu lived in the Warring State era, and his very famous work, The Art of War, was influenced by the increasing violence of this era. In contrast to its name, the book does not really focus on wartime strategies, but on strategies that would prevent the outbreak of war. The principles and methods of Greek diplomacy had been developed by the 5th century. However, from Homeric records, we learn that before the 5th century, Greeks had used embassies as a means of foreign affairs. Again, in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the first elements of interstate relations could be found in conjunction with the Olympic Games held in 776 BC. Regardless of its being the cradle of the Western civilization, ancient Greece cannot be considered as the golden era of diplomacy. Greeks had their indigenous customs reflecting their common culture. The city-state system of which no single city-state was powerful enough to establish hegemony, such as the one we witnessed in certain periods of time in the ancient Near East, compelled the city-states to deal with each other as equals. This structure caused the diplomatic traffic, although this traffic did not lead to the emergence of a fixed system and an administrative structure. Considering its longevity and organization, the Roman Empire contributed little to the development of diplomacy. This, of course, does not mean that diplomacy was unimportant for the Romans. However, as it is widely accepted that the contribution of Romans to diplomacy is much more related to the international law and is represented in the theory, not the practice of diplomacy. Romans inherited the diplomacy pattern from Greece, but they developed a distinctive method to suit their own needs. Now let's talk about medieval diplomacy and see how diplomacy was used in the Byzantine Empire and the early Islamic world. The Byzantine Empire originally was the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and it was one of the longest-lasting political entities in history from the year 330 until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. One of the most important reasons for the empire's longevity was its use of diplomacy. Diplomacy was a necessity for the Byzantine Empire because it had enemies on all of its borders, and there was always a threat of invasion, while for a certain time it had limited military power. Since the rulers of the empire were aware of the military weakness, they first adapted the practices of former civilizations and developed their own way of diplomacy with their political and cultural contributions. The Byzantines employed a number of tactics, both overt and covert, to achieve their aims through diplomacy rather than military force. It is therefore common to label Byzantine diplomacy as war by other means. The Bureau of Barbarians as a department of government was responsible for foreign relations, primarily with the barbarians living on the Balkan Peninsula. The Bureau sent envoys on diplomatic missions to barbarian lands in order to gather information from every possible source. Religion was also a method of diplomacy in the Byzantine Empire, and it conducted a missionary operation. Byzantine priests were often spreading faith in front of military authority. Diplomacy in the Islamic world began with the establishment of the first Islamic state in 622, and it was not founded through military means but by a social contract, the Medina Charter. The charter was an agreement settling the intertribal conflict between Muslims, Jews, and pagans, and it constituted a free state of a pluralistic community. It is a constitution which provided for dispute resolution, a tax system, rights and responsibilities to both Muslims and non-Muslims. During this time of the Prophet, diplomatic representatives were received and they were accepted through ceremonies. Gift exchanging was a common conduct of diplomacy as in the previous civilizations and cultures. The function of diplomats was to communicate with other states, to conclude an agreement or alliance which was decided previously, to arrange the exchange of prisoners and a truce, and to announce war. Most certainly, another function of envoys was to gather information about the weaknesses or strengths of the host country. The function of diplomacy in these early years was at the most basic level, since the strength of the state in the absence of at least an equal power did not raise the need to a more complex function for diplomacy. So, this is the end of our program for Chapter 2 of the Diplomacy course. Goodbye and see you in our next program, Chapter 3.